Okay, the last panel was on transportation and mobile sources, and this one is on stationary sources and electricity. And leading the panel discussion is Lucas Davis, Associate Professor at the Haas School. Please welcome Lucas.
Okay, great. So we're going to be talking about electricity markets in this panel. This got introduced a bit by Severin, but hopefully in the next hour we can dig a little bit deeper into this. We have a terrific panel. Shmuel Oren is Eric Isaac Professor of Industrial Engineering at UC Berkeley. He's an expert in electricity markets, market design, pricing. We have Jamie Fine, who asked a question at the end of the last session, who already said he's a graduate of ERG. That's Berkeley's Energy and Resources Group. He is an economist at the Environmental Defense Fund, works in advocating reducing environmental impacts from energy systems. And then last, we'll hear from Scott Murdishaw, who is a senior energy advisor for Mike Peavy, the president of the California Public Utility Commission. You're also a Berkeley grad. You're a graduate of the Goldman School of Public Policy. So we're going to have a great setup. The format is going to follow exactly what you saw in the last panel. Everyone is going to take about 10 minutes to do some setup, and then we'll hopefully have some cross conversation and then open up to the audience. Let's get going.
Thank you for inviting me. One of my the hats that I'm wearing is I'm a member of the Market Surveillance Committee of the California System Operator. And the reason I'm mentioning that because I want to emphasize that I'm not speaking on behalf of the committee, nor on behalf of the California System Operator. And but I am going to use some slides that were published by the CAISO that is going to help me to tell the story that I'm trying to tell you. So as an engineer, I believe that the devil is in the details. And anytime you discuss all these big policy issues, you have to think about how it's going to be done. So I'll start with what has been termed as the duck chart. This is something that has been floating recently in the community. And basically what it shows the net load as we increase the amount of solar penetration. And the belly of the chart, so you see you start from 2013 and it goes down all the way to the net load 2020 if we are going to continue on the path of increasing the penetration of PV solar and solar central. Well, the thing that keeps the ISO awake at night is that steep ramp that you see there. Because what that means is that within a very short period of time when the sun sets and the load, the main load comes on, you have to come up with other than solar units, with thermal units that are going to be able to increase their output fast enough so that the lights will stay on. And this is a major problem, because to do that, it means that in spite of all the solar that is going to come on, we're going to have all these other thermal units sitting by at minimum load, synchronized to the network that can kick in as soon as the sun sets. And that's going to defeat what we're trying to do, both from an economic point of view and from an environmental perspective. Now people say, well, but then the wind starts to kick in. Well, this is the combination of solar and wind. That has also been published with 20% RPS. And again, you see that you have these big gaps that somehow, and the big ramp down and ramp up, and ramp down and ramp up when you superimpose the wind, which is primarily active at night, with the sun that is active during the day. And this is actually showing you that not only that, but when you start to have clouds, then that solar curve is not as smooth as you thought it would be. So those are problems that are very serious problems that the ISO is confronting, and how to come up with enough flexible thermal resources to be able to make up that difference and to keep tracking all these non-controllable resources that are renewables but by nature are intermittent. So that's the issue. Now, the ISO, now this is, when you think about wind is not only variable, but it's also very uncertain. This is known as the spaghetti chart, which shows the wind prediction when you're starting to get closer and closer to real time. And it's all over the place. Even though on average we know how much wind we're going to get, exactly when we're going to get it and how should we dispatch the rest of the resources on the network is a very difficult problem. And not only that, but the wind is also negatively correlated with the load, so it's kind of off when we don't get it when we need it. So the way the system operators is dealing with that, they've been running these studies, and they say basically if we want to accommodate 20–30% renewable penetration, what we need is somehow to procure more flexible resources. And they did those studies by 2020, and if you look at that, by the time you take into consideration that we're going to take offline the one true cooling generators, which is planned, and you think about all the solar and the wind that is going to come on board, the ISO came up with an estimate that we need to build another 4,600 megawatt of flexible ramping capacity in order to be able to deal with all these high ramps. And so this is expensive, and when you run them, of course, you cannot just start them from zero, so you have to keep all these resources at minimum load. That defeats, kind of interferes with prices in the market and causes a lot of problems. So, the really only sustainable solution, the only way to deal with that is to be very aggressive about demand response alternatives, because it's the demand response is the only way to mobilizing demand response is really the only way to deal in a sustainable way with all these ramps and need for flexibility. Effectively, we have to have a paradigm shift from the idea that you build generation to follow the load to a new shift where load has to follow the available supplies. And this is not something that we are doing. That's not the system operator is used to. It's a whole new concept of how do you maintain the lights on. You basically say the lights can stay on, but everything else maybe stay off for a while. Now, there are several ways to do that. One is responsive load. One is energy efficiency. The low-hanging fruit in this business is really deferrable load. Anytime you hit a building like that, there is no reason to always, if you turn the thermostat off for half an hour, it's not going to cause major discomfort. Now, every building that we have is like a battery. It's a storage of energy. So we can take it offline for a while and wait, and instead of immediately having that sharp ramp can be flattened if we are using the right technology and we're using the right way to control all of this, what we call the flexible or deferrable load. We haven't done that. And, so electric vehicle charging is one of the things that can be moved around. Heating, ventilation, and air conditioning can be moved around. Water heaters, electric space heaters, refrigeration, agricultural pumping, all this thermostatically controlled load and deferrable loads are things that we can manipulate in order to soften those ramps and avoid having to build more generation. But we have to do it in a creative way, and that's where a lot of the innovation is going to come in. Now, demand response is not something new. I mean, I've been long enough in this business to have the scars and have some of the brochures that were used in the 80s to try to promote demand response idea. This is George Burns was actually the spokesman for a cycling of air conditioner program that Southern California Edison was promoting in the 80s. And the idea is that you get a discount. You can make up to $165 a year if you are willing to subject your air conditioner to cycling. There were interruptible service contracts that we had there. This was called the demand subscription program, where we will allow the utility with half an hour notice to curtail your, to reduce the fuse size at your household so that you have to disconnect certain things, but you still get your refrigerator, or you can watch the Super Bowl if you want instead. So those are ideas that were around, and while today the metering and control technology is cheaper, and technology, in my opinion, was never really a barrier to implementing demand response. And the problem has always been that everybody wants to demonstrate that they have the right technology and the capability, and all the money that comes from DOE and from is going on demonstration project, but we always failed to think about what it takes to make it a reality. And to do that, you need a regulatory framework, you need the institutional structure, and you need a sustainable business model that is going to create an end-to-end system where customers are willing to get their load manipulated, and that the system operator is willing to accept whatever the customer is doing as a substitute to deploying or implementing or turning on more generators. So for example, a regulatory framework, everybody now has a smart meter in their house. Unfortunately, the smart meter is only used to read the meter. PG&E, if you ask them, what can I do with the smart meter? Well, we're reading your meter without having to send a person. Well, we need to shift to do what Texas has been doing, make the information that comes out of the smart meter the property of the customer, allow the customer to assign it to third-party aggregators that are going to be able to come up with new innovative ideas of how to manage efficient energy inside the house, and how to use your willingness to accept a reduction in service in order to help the ISO. And that's not going to happen if you just rely on the investment-owned utility to do that. If you went to the Berk, there was a conference here with a lot of posters. I think that energy efficiency and the demand response manipulation is going to be the next .com if you're just going to provide to the third parties the information that is needed in order to do that. Economic paradigms for demand response. So one idea is to provide real-time prices to retail customers. This is kind of the economic holy grail. I personally think that treating electricity as a commodity at the retail level, it may work well at the wholesale level, but I think that at the retail level, people like to think of electricity as a service. So the alternative is to provide quality differentiated service based on contracted load control options. And so basically you sign contracts that allows the aggregator to control either the total amount of electricity that you're going to get into your household, or to control specific devices in your house according to some protocol, and that can be then aggregated into wholesale products that can be offered to the ISO into the wholesale electricity market. So we need an aggregator business model that will bridge the gap between the wholesale commodity market and the retail service. And as I say, making the smart meter accessible to the customer to be able to manage their own load using some Zigbee devices or whatever inside the home, and then enabling the customer to assign access to the data to third-party aggregator is a key element in doing that. These are just some ideas. There is a company here called Color Power, and their idea is to tag devices when you buy them with different colors that will indicate whether they are flexible, whether you always need them, or we are not flexible, and that can be then aggregated through some algorithms and turn into wholesale product can be built in the wholesale market. My preference is to do that at the meter level, allow the customer to make decisions on the fly whether they want, again, to keep their refrigerator going or to watch the Super Bowl if their input gets reduced to 1 kilowatt or 2 kilowatt during certain periods. But then the contract will specify the frequency at which your fuse size gets reduced to different level, and within that, and then you can control whatever is inside the house to meet your contractual obligation. And then you need the aggregator can aggregate a lot of these homes together and repackage that load relief so that the system operator can treat it as a virtual generator and use that to mitigate some of the ramps and to deal with the adverse effect of intermittent resources. So this is what I have to say.
Okay, next is Jamie Fine from Environmental Defense Fund. We've seen a duck chart, a spaghetti chart. What's next?
I'm going to keep these pictures. They're terrific. Look how young George Burns looks. That tells you how old. EDF, I'm Jamie Fine. My title is Senior Economist with Environmental Defense Fund. I graduated from the Energy and Resources group here at Berkeley, and I will tell you a secret. I'm not really an economist. But with my training at the Energy and Resources group, I can play one quite effectively at Environmental Defense Fund. And so that's actually important for you all to hear. I'm saying this, the students in the room recognize that the interdisciplinary training you get in programs like ERG can be very valuable when you sit in a seat like the seat I sit in at an advocacy organization at EDF. Quick word about EDF. We're about a 400-person environmental organization. We were the ones who started with the original concept of sue the bastards out of Long Island in the early 60s when we saw that DDT was poisoning our national bird. We brought science to the table in those lawsuits. We now combine science, economics with law to tackle the world's biggest environmental problems. Our catchphrase is finding the ways that work, and that often means working directly with commercial interests. For example, we're the ones who helped McDonald's take the styrofoam out of their packaging. We're the ones working now with Walmart to help them green their supply chain. I should make it clear that we don't take a penny from any of those corporations. That's part of how we can maintain our position and help them to change. Another thing EDF has been getting interested in increasingly is behavioral science. And one thing we've learned from behavioral science is that when you produce a fact versus fiction document to debunk fiction with your facts, what you find when you query the readers of those devices an hour or a day or several days later is they remember the fiction but not the fact. Could you turn the screen back on? I actually thought about offering this duck chart as an impetus for my comments. This is fiction. I want to make that clear. This is fiction. The narrative that the CAISO has produced is this fear of this 17,000 megawatt ramp in 2 hours in year 2020. We're not there yet. We're 7 years off from there. And we don't know what assumptions are built into this ramp. So for example, what pricing signals are customers seeing at 5 p.m. in the afternoon? We don't know. The more we show this duck chart, the more the general population tends to accept it as fact. Okay? Don't accept it. This is one possible future. Many of us, most of us, are working towards a different future. And Shmuel, you're spot on the demand response opportunity. So I want to back up a little bit and tackle the questions that Lucas laid out for us, and I promise to do this quickly. So you wanted us to define what is the renewable portfolio standard in California. So last year we met a 20% RPS, renewable portfolio standard. That meant that 1 out of every 5 kilowatt hours served to customers by our investor-owned utilities in California was generated from a renewable resource. And by 2020, we're endeavoring to get to 33% RPS. That means 1 out of every 3 kilowatt hours served to customers. Could you leave that on, please? Well, I'm going to make a point with it right now. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. Sorry. So here's the thing that we need to get our heads around. We're talking about this side of the meter that the utility or the system operator is seeing, not the amount of energy that users are actually using. What you're seeing here, the depression, is because of our very successful rooftop solar program in California. We have 150,000 rooftop systems generating over a gigawatt, with over a gigawatt of capacity right now. So what the system operator and the utilities are seeing from their side of the meter is what we call net load, right? And so it's great that this is a success story that we're expecting, that we're generating so much of our own electricity on our roofs that we don't have the system-wide peak in the middle of the afternoon anymore. And we expect that to slowly over time grow into a depression. So in terms of the net load that the system operators see is going down. Great news. Great news, right? So while some are offering this as a source of concern, this is a clear signal of a success story. Now let me ask you all a quick question. In California, our investor-owned utilities, how do they generate profits? Say that again, Rafa? Steel in the ground, right? They make infrastructure investments, transmission and distribution systems, and to the extent that they own it, generation. And our regulators say, you know what, y'all, utilities, you need to borrow money to make those investments, and you need to be able to return and compensate to your investors a reasonable rate of return, say 10%. So if the utility spends $1 billion, the regulator grants them $100 million in profits. So the utilities are not about actually not trying to sell more energy. What's exciting from a utility profit perspective is, we have a new peak we need to build steel to meet, unless that peak never shows up. So where are we today? Where are we today right now? Getting back to the RPS. The good news is if we're netting out more energy from the system because we're generating our own, that makes the RPS easier. Remember, the RPS is a percentage. There's a numerator and a denominator. The numerator is the amount of renewables you have to serve to consumers. But if the denominator goes down, you have to produce less renewables. So if we're all making energy efficiency or conservation investments or generating our own, it actually reduces pressure on the RPS. Lucas wanted us to comment, do we think we need to build more power plants in California because of that ramp? Right? And the answer is no. The answer is a strong no, at least not yet. Right? We have a few years to plan for this. Right now, we have a reserve capacity in California of about 40%. That means we have 40% more generation capacity than we think we will need on a peak day when one of our major generation facilities goes out and a major transmission line goes out. So think about this if you're making a 12-egg omelet, right? Now, you want to make sure you have plenty of eggs for your omelet, so you keep 14 eggs in your fridge. But the way the system planner plans the system is actually you need to be prepared for 2 eggs to drop onto the floor along the way, and you still need extra eggs in the fridge. So we have to buy 17 eggs for every 12-egg omelet we make in California. It's not a very good investment for consumers. So where are we heading with this? What are some of the solutions? Demand response is what Shmuel brought up, and it's very exciting. It's now increasingly enabled with smart grid. Now, you say it's not a technology limit. Here's a way to think about demand response. If I tell everyone price is going to be higher, demand will adjust, right? Do we buy lots and lots of strawberries in the wintertime? No, we don't, right? Why not? Because they're expensive and they actually don't taste so good. Well, the same idea should apply to the way we price power that consumers in California see. And we don't do it that way in California. We use an inclining block tiered structure, which means everyone's allocated a certain amount of power at one price, and then another chunk of power at another price, and then another chunk of power at a higher price. Right? So that means literally on the first day of the month, all the energy you use in your house is your cheapest price. And by the end of the month, if you're using more than your low price allocation, any energy use is expensive. If instead we utilize our smart meters, which are now deployed around, all around the state, to measure and charge consumers based on the time that they use energy, keep in mind the old analog meters, we read them at the end of the month and say, well, this is the amount of electricity used, let's bill you. But if instead we build customers based on the timing of their energy use, don't think about that picture now, which is just kind of a generic day, but think about your day and your energy use, and think about if you were actually getting salient signals from your utility or others, notably third parties, saying, if you use energy at these peak price times of the day, your bill is going to go up. But you have an option now, which is you can use that energy at a different time of the day, and you can control your bill. Right now, the tiered structure we have does create a good incentive for conserving energy use, for making energy efficiency investments, or for making a rooftop solar investment if you are buying energy in the top tier. But it doesn't open the door for shifting load on a daily basis to manage your bills, right? So think about not the wealthy customers who can afford rooftop solar. Think about the poor customers in California. Right now, about 30% of all Californians get a discounted energy rate. So the way we're helping poor Californians get access to affordable energy is deeply pernicious. We're saying, here, we're going to discount the energy you use. So you have no price signal or a very much depressed one. Oh, and by the way, you're more likely than other folks in California to be living near the power plant that we're running at peak because we can't control our peak demand and we don't have any pricing method to do that for residential customers. To wrap up quickly, Lucas wanted us to tackle AB 32. So AB 32 is California's Global Warming Solutions Act, adopted in 2006. EDF was the sponsor of that act. It actually established a cap on economy-wide emissions in California. We said by 2020, we got to get down to 1990 levels. And then within that goal, we established a cap and trade program for our utilities starting this year. And in a couple of years, we're going to include natural gas providers and our transportation emissions into that cap and trade program. That's when things are going to get really exciting. So there was a comment earlier that I wanted, well, the question was, what's this going to mean for energy prices? Not a whole lot. What's it going to mean for natural gas price, or for gasoline prices? Not a whole lot. $10 per ton for carbon is about 8 cents per gallon. And right now, carbon allowances in California are trading for about $13 per ton. So I'll just mention that cap and trade programs provided an innovation incentive and get consumers and polluters thinking about the cost of their pollution in ways that lead to innovation, even if the price of an allowance is low today. It's really anticipation of prices going forward. So when you look at what's affecting the prices we see in our electricity bills, we've got a bunch of kind of problems in there. A lot of what we're hearing from the duck chart story is all the folks who are investing in rooftop solar are netting out their generation and not paying anything into the system, and they're getting a free ride, and that's creating a cross-subsidy. That's going to create a consumer revolt. Here's some facts for you. The amount of cross-subsidy that's happening by rooftop solar owners is about $30 million a year, and that's top-tier payers helping to cover the cost that those other top-tier customers aren't helping to pay because they have rooftop solar. When you look at low-income customer subsidies in California, it adds up to about $1 billion per year. $1 billion per year. I did the math with First Principles just last week on PG&E service territory. It's about $500 million a year. That's $32 per care customer household per month. And we should be asking, how should we spend that money better, more efficiently? I will close by saying that the PUC is in the process of revisiting how we structure residential rates. That's the thing I'm working on today. It's a really exciting opportunity to both use the smart meters that, by the way, consumers have, we compensated the utilities for spending about $10 billion on deploying smart grid in California. The way we get our value out of that is first by smart pricing strategy, like residential time of use pricing. And then the other piece, which is really exciting, which Shmuel touched on, is making that data, energy use data, available to third parties. So another hard fact to get our heads around, the average energy user in America spends about 9 minutes per year thinking about their energy bill. That's less than a minute per month. So if you've got consumers who aren't paying attention, and you've got these new pricing structures that enable new strategies for managing your bill, how do we make it happen? And the solution, we think, is third parties. Opening up the energy space for competition and for third parties to figure out value propositions built on time of use and to deliver those propositions to consumers. I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. That was terrific. So Scott Murdishaw is going to be our next speaker. He's from the California Public Utilities Commission. I wanted to give Shmuel, though, a second to jump in here while Scott's getting set up. I actually heard a lot of agreement here, but I would love to hear, you can say anything you want, but I would love to hear you respond. How much scope is there for pricing over the next 7 years to make that duck chart a fiction?
Well, as I said, we can try to flatten that slope by being proactive with demand response. So this is kind of not taking that opportunity into consideration. I must say that, you know, we seem to have a disagreement here about the role of pricing, because even though we know that people are going to respond to pricing in some way, if you see how system operators are running the system, there is a 24-hour planning. You lock in, you turn on plants, you're trying to make sure. Then there is an hour ahead. Planning. So our traditional way of keeping the lights on is that everything has to be secured in advance. Now, unless you're going to completely revolutionize the rules by which NERC is going to rewrite the rules and the ISO is going to operate the system, relying on the fact that some people are going to respond to high prices is never going to make the ISO turn on one less plant, unless they can guarantee that 24 hours in advance. So our technology has to be adapted to that. Now, if the people can commit in advance 24 hours, yeah, I'm going to respond to that price, and I'm going to lock my meter on that, and then the ISO can somehow ping their commitment, they will rely on that. But unless you can do that through the technology to guarantee that, that demand response is never going to translate to a reduction in how many plants are going to be turned on and kept in reserve. And that's something that we have to take into consideration. We cannot just work on the customer side. We have to be realistic about what's going to make, how to turn that customer response into wholesale products that are going to be used by the system operator.
Okay, well, they both covered everything that I really thought interesting that I had to say. But I think I can help fill in some gaps, and actually, in light of what both Shmuel and Jamie have said, I think I have some interesting responses and can talk about what the PUC is doing to try to solve some of these problems. And I'll actually go back to the duct chart as well. Let's see, is that, Shmuel, this is going back from here?
You may want to turn that on. Oh, you want?
Yeah, okay, it was there.
Looks like a popular chart.
Well, I first saw this chart just a few weeks ago. The Harvard Electricity Policy Group has an East Coast meeting and a West Coast meeting. A few weeks ago, they met down in Orange County, and somebody was showing this chart and talking about demand response, a gentleman from EPRI. And so that was the first time I came across it. I think I've since seen it 4 times at different conferences and workshops. I'm going to step away from the mic if I can. I don't know if for purposes of recording. Okay. Okay. So it is important, like Jamie said, to keep in mind, this is a projection. This is a model-based projection. And on top of that, this is a worst-case scenario for 2020. If I remember correctly, Shmuel, this is a spring. This model is a spring day where air conditioning loads are even not as high as they would be later in the summer, but the sun is shining pretty strongly, so you're seeing net load not just as a function of rooftop solar, but also as solar on the transmission system, large utility-scale solar. So one question that I've heard some other analysts who have been participating in our long-term planning and resource adequacy proceedings ask is, if the goal is to deliver every single megawatt hour of electricity generated by a wind turbine or solar panels or solar thermal plants, if that is a necessity, if you view that as an absolute firm requirement, whatever megawatt hour is delivered, then this is the shape of this curve. So there are other options, though. Demand response, which Shmuel talked quite a bit about. Another, which we've actually already seen in the Northwest, is curtailment. So if you have provisions in contracts with renewable energy developers that on some of those worst days when the overgeneration is going to be most severe, if you allow us to just curtail a few % of your production, we'll just trip some of the inverters at the solar farm. We will ask you to feather your blades at some of the wind farms so that production goes down. We're not squeezing every single megawatt hour out of those facilities that we possibly could. The problem is actually a lot more manageable because this is the worst case scenario. So if you can chop a little bit here, with demand response, you can chop some of the load at the top. The problem starts to look more tractable than it did originally. So in addition to demand response, which is challenging, we've been working on it, as Shmuel indicated, for 30 years. Utilities have had AC cycling programs. That was really about the extent of it in the residential sector until recently. But the new technologies that Shmuel mentioned with smart meters, I think, actually open that up to just about every single end use in your home. What that's going to require, though, and I think this is a fair criticism from Shmuel, is that we do have to start taking more advantage of the smart meters. And in addition to that, as Jamie mentioned, I think we need to incentivize end users with more appropriate rates that actually reflect cost. And unfortunately, that's just not the case today. The tiered rates that Jamie mentioned, these date back to the mid-'70s. This was before we had smart meters, and it was before we actually had a discount program for low-income customers. So in the legislation, the original legislation from 1976, the rationale behind creating two-tiered rates was twofold. It was to encourage energy conservation, the thought being that if we give you a certain amount of a baseline allocation of relatively cheap electricity, that's an amount that everybody's going to use anyway. So you're going to use up to a certain amount. It's going to be based on, let's say, 50% of the average consumption in your climate zone. And when California is such a diverse state, we do have different climate zones. It's obviously not fair to hold people in the desert to the same standard as people on the coast. So the allocations differ by location. Then once you surpass that level, then we start charging you more than the actual cost of service. And the incentive then should be, in theory, that people would reduce, because the more they use, the higher their bills become on a non-linear basis. That was rationale number one. And rationale number two was to protect low-income customers, the thought being there that there's a correlation between income and usage. Well, after decades of having tiered rates legislated in California, and in fact, after the electricity crisis even exacerbated, we went from 2 tiers to 5. The distance between those tiers has widened considerably over time. In the past, there would be a 15 to 20% difference between tiers 1 and 2. Now you have more than a 200% difference between just tiers 2 and 3. So pricing has become very nonlinear. And in light of all that, the most recent research counterintuitively finds that based on an analysis of customers in Southern California who are located near the border of Southern California Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric, where rates were changing by different amounts at different times, studying the actual behavior, what happened, how much did people's consumption change in response to those price signals. That researcher, a gentleman named Koichiro Ito, who was a grad student here at Berkeley and is now at Stanford, he found that the overall conservation effect was zero. Absolutely zero. And the reason for that is that customers don't know when they hit these different tiers. They just know what their bill is at the end of the month. That's the only price signal that you see. So people who were consuming relatively small amounts think electricity is pretty cheap. And I'm a perfect example. I live here in Berkeley. I almost never exceed tier 1. In the summer, my electric bill is $18 a month. I think electricity is crazy cheap. I have no incentive to conserve. I do because of my profession and what I know about the externalities associated with my use of energy. But if I didn't know better, I would think electricity is very cheap. So people who are receiving these below-cost bills consume more than they otherwise would. And it's true, the people who receive bills that are higher than the actual cost to generate and deliver that electricity do use a little bit less. These two things perfectly cancel each other out. So we're not getting conservation. What about protecting low-income customers? Well, the care discount, which was instituted in the 80s, is responsible for the vast majority of the transfer of wealth to low-income customers. So problem largely solved. It is true that because there are some effects that are combinations of both, their interactive effects of both the tiers and the fact that there is a discount, it's hard to tease out, but research that was done right here at Berkeley by Severin Bornstein estimated that the care discount alone, I mean the tiered rates, apart from the care discount, is saving low-income customers about $5 a month. So in exchange for that transfer of $5 a month, we've really tied our hands. We're not sending the right price signals about the cost of power at 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. on a hot summer afternoon, and we need to do that. Right now, the PUC can't. Our hands are tied by statute. There is activity going on at the legislature. Bills have been introduced that would give us more latitude. There is a proceeding that I helped to initiate at the PUC to look into this very question, and I think it's high time that we had some rate reform, because without the price signals, what is your motivation? Why do you care about shifting load? Why do you pay $5 to have a home area network device that can interact with your meter to help manage your load? You don't. You have no incentive, because doing so saves you exactly $0. So I think, from my perspective, rate reform is a serious obstacle to helping to solve some of these problems and integrating renewables. Couple of last points. So, as part of the research that has been conducted at the PUC, in light of the residential rate reform proceeding that we're doing, we've been hearing about what other utilities around the country are doing in terms of innovating in the residential rate design arena. And I'm sad to say that we're getting our butts kicked by Oklahoma Gas and Electric. This is a relatively small utility in the middle of the country in Oklahoma, which is not known for being a leader in environmental policy or utility policy. But residential rates at Oklahoma Gas and Electric, you now get to choose between six different rates. A third of customers voluntarily opted in to time differentiated rates. About 10% of those customers opted into real-time rates that change hourly. And that's the holy grail. I'm embarrassed that we can't keep pace with what's happening in Oklahoma, Oklahoma Gas and Electric. I find that personally embarrassing. The major reason is that and there is some legitimate concern that ratepayer advocates and low-income advocates express, but it's this concern about the effects that such rates would have on low-income customers that is really the main obstacle to having more cost-effective or cost-efficient rates in California. Just one last point on technology and how that's going to help us solve these problems too. I'm not sure within the ISO's model here how much of this. Now, this is net load. It's a little bit difficult to explain, but that's basically the actual load of customers minus all the solar that comes on in the afternoon, because that just happens. So when you subtract the actual load from the solar production, that's what flexible resources have to meet. Now, to the extent that some of that is solar thermal, especially solar thermal with storage, those are facilities that can store up the energy during the day, not produce it during the hours and the minutes that the sun is actually shining most strongly in those facilities, and then they can release that energy later in the day, and that energy comes at a premium. Those facilities do cost more than solar PV now, but the PUC and my boss, the President PV, think that it's worth it to not put all of our eggs in one basket, or maybe two baskets, wind and solar PV. So we believe in having some technology diversity in the renewable energy space, so that we see more diversity and don't just have load shapes that look this severe. So with that, I'll actually just open it up to questions and some dialogue here amongst the panelists. I think that we have some interesting responses here that we can provide for each other. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Jamie, do you want to respond to any of this?
Well, I really more my thoughts are additive. One thing I didn't say is that ultimately where we'd like to go is not just putting a time signal on the price of energy that all consumers are seeing, and noting also that commercial and industrial energy users are already seeing time of use prices. But ultimately what we'd like to see is a complete unbundling of the rates that consumers are paying. Right now you pay one rate that includes energy and all the system upkeep and sunk costs like paying for Diablo Canyon. And what we'd like to see is the rates completely unbundled so that the diversity of consumers could get the diversity of services and products that they want. If you're a rooftop solar owner, you want to be presented with the value proposition of deciding, do I get the fanciest, most expensive inverter with telemetry so I could sell a demand response type product into the marketplace because I'm also co-locating with an electric vehicle, or do I want to have the lowest cost system and maybe pay the utility for some energy quality management services? So the more we can unbundle it, the more we open up the space for innovative new business models, and that includes providing a real incentive for the utilities themselves.
I want to take advantage of the fact that Scott's here to ask. So Shmuel pushed for these smart meter data to become more widely available. And I think that would open up to a lot of the kind of stuff that Jamie has in mind. So we've got you on the hot seat here or something, but would you advocate to your boss, Mike Peavy, that to push the California IOUs to make these data more available? Traditionally they're pretty hesitant to share these data.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, I'm not sure if Shmuel is aware, but just in the past year or so, and this is not my main area of policy focus at the PUC, so I am not as in the weeds on the details of these decisions. But sometime within the past year, the PUC did issue a decision on customer data access, privacy, and security related to smart meter data. I believe we were the first jurisdiction to issue a comprehensive regulatory framework for that. And in that decision, I think that we have erred on the side of really keeping customer data pretty sacrosanct. They have control of their data, but that decision did explicitly authorize those individual customers to give access to their data to third parties. So now it's going to be up to the providers of those services and technologies to reach out to customers, explain the benefits of the technologies and services they can provide, and sign customers up and get them to share their data. But the utility cannot unilaterally decide to share customer data.
Yeah, I may be a little biased here because I work for 8 years as an advisor to the Texas Public Utility Commission, and they kind of started from retail competition as being the driving force of their whole deregulation. And from day one, they made the whole issue of customer registration and who serves what customer something that the whole registration is really managed by the ISO, and that completely streamlined the process by which customers can leave their home, incumbent utility and be served by an independent energy provider. They have 60 independent energy providers there that handle customer account. They also made from day one all the smart meter data the property of the customer, and the customer is free to assign it to a third party to manage it any way they want for billing, for and other uses. And I'm not aware of any security problems there. They never encounter any security. I think that the security issue is kind of a cop-out that people are using here in order not to give customer control of their data.
Very briefly, I don't know if you all are familiar with Green Button, but one of the smart grid enabled opportunities is now if you go online, you can click on the green button on your web page for your energy use, and it will automatically download it in a standardized format. This is an initiative led by the White House, and the idea is you can take your green button data and make it available to app developers who will run it through their software and give you a very low transactional cost kind of advice about how to manage your energy bill. It's available by all 3 California utilities. The utilities also, by the way, are implementing a strategy called Privacy by Design, which basically says it's the customer's data. They can choose to share it if they want.
Okay, great. Let's open this up to the audience.
My name is John Perkins, and I really appreciated the presentations. Just at the end, we heard a little bit about storage, and I would like to ask any of the panelists to talk more about storage as a way to even out these fluctuations in supply that create a problem for whatever the load is.
Well, again, this is not one of the main issue areas that I work on at the PUC, but in a very recently issued decision in the long-term procurement proceeding, specifically for Edison, the way that these proceedings traditionally have worked is that the CEC models future load growth. The PUC more or less accepts those projections. Those projections include projections of savings from energy efficiency. I'm not sure how much how much credit they gave for demand response programs. Very little, is my understanding. Rafi's seconding that. So whatever gap remained between future load projection and actual available resources then became an authorization to the utility. You may procure up to this number of megawatts of new fossil capacity. Those projections also do take into account renewables. Renewables have their capacity is discounted based on, I think, fairly rough probabilistic estimations about the actual capacity they provide on average. So if you have rooftop solar scattered across a fairly wide service territory, clouds are going to cause a lot of variability at a very local level, but spread across the whole system. On average, I think the net qualifying capacity for PV is about 50% or something in that range. So in this proceeding for SCE, for the first time, the PUC said that gap between what the unmet load, we're not just going to authorize you to fill that with new fossil resources. You have to meet what's called the loading order: efficiency first, demand response, renewables, and then clean fossil. So that was a policy that the PUC established under my boss's leadership back in 2002, what was called the First Energy Action Plan. And environmental groups like EDF challenged the PUC to really adhere to it for future planning. So the decision that was voted out for Edison does still allow, I think, a few hundred megawatts of fossil procurement. It requires 50 megawatts of storage procurement, so for the first time, a storage obligation, and additional megawatts to be met through demand response. So it's the first time that I'm aware of that we've actually had any storage obligation. Most of the storage activity in California has been through the Self-Generation Incentive Program, which is a program that incentivizes customers to adopt behind-the-meter technologies. In the past, it was the genesis of the solar PV rooftop program. That was carved out into its own separate program in 2006. Today, it mostly incentivizes fuel cells, a little bit of distributed wind. Actually, if you drive on Highway 80 out towards Sacramento, you drive past the Budweiser plant where there's a giant wind turbine that's just sitting all by itself. That's the Self-Generation Incentive Program at work. So a lot of storage activity has been happening at very small scale, but to be honest, I'm not sure how much that storage really helps with this problem if the correct price signals aren't sent, if we don't have real-time pricing, for example. So it will result in a fairly consistent shifting of load over time, but on days where we really need it, will those storage systems provide even additional output? I'm not sure.
You want to add?
Yeah, storage is really a great solution. I mean, and it's not something new. Actually, back in the 80s, there was a 40 megawatt storage facility in Chico that was built, and if you look at countries like Brazil that had 5-year reservoirs of water and they can pump water up the hill, they don't have any problem with the timing of wind and the timing on solar and all that. I mean, they just fill in, pump it back into the reservoir. Denmark sends their extra wind power to Norway and pump it up the hill. So this is really so there's no question that storage is the great panacea. It's too expensive though. That's the problem. So before we start to put a lot of money in storage, this is one of the areas that technology is going one day to get us to the point where storage is competitive. But meanwhile, we have all this virtual storage. Every building, every area where you can shift demand is de facto can be scheduled as a storage device. And that's where we have to spend a lot of our innovative ideas to try to take advantage of that storage. About 30% of our load can be handled as has a certain amount of storage in it that can be utilized.
I'm Alex Papalexopoulos, CEO and founder of Eco International. We're designing wholesale electricity markets. We have software to simulate energy markets. I have several comments. First of all, I fully agree with Shmuel. His comment about the DR as a solution or part of the solution to the DAC problem. This is very important. Also, his comment about the retail customers. Treating electricity as a commodity for retail customers simply does not make any sense. By the way, we are the color power people that he put in his slide up there. We really believe that service plans and quality differentiated services is what we need for retail customers. Now, for the DAC slide, can you bring it up? Because this is very, very important. And there are some issues that I don't think they are clear to the audience here about, the second panelist, he said that this is fiction. This is not fiction. This is very real. And for the people who are not in this business, this means blackout. They didn't mention that word. This is blackout. We have 2 brownouts in Europe today because of this problem. I'm engaged with 3 European countries to change the market rules and solve operational problems with this. This limitation, it's not capacity limitation, it's very important to understand. This is ramping limitation. You may have all the capacity in the world, but if it takes 4 or 5 hours to bring it up to the level you want it, it's useless. So you need what Shmuel called flexible capacity. This is very, very important. So if you have old coal plants that take 12 hours to bring online, or takes 5 hours to get them from one point to the next, it's not going to solve the problem. We need flexible capacity. And for that, we need to plan now for 2020. We cannot wait. So it's really, maybe it's the worst case scenario. The third speaker mentioned that, okay, let's do curtailments. Well, first of all, curtailments is not part of the contracts in most of the countries. In Spain, for example, they try to breach the contracts with the developers to reduce the tariffs and enter into provisions to allow curtailments under certain conditions. And the producers, the wind producers, took them to court and they lost. A contract is a contract. We have the similar problems here in the West. BPA, for example, during mid of the night in a wet year, they have 2 choices to solve overgeneration problems. Curtail wind, and then they are sued by the wind producers, and this has happened, or spill water, and then they are sued by the environmentalists. In either case, the problem exists, is real, it is will be causing blackouts. So this is not fiction. Furthermore,
Let's just because we've got to get to lunch.
Okay, maybe one last comment.
Do you want to have an add-on question? So
Okay.
why don't you go, and then we'll have yeah. Thanks. No, it's really interesting, but I want to.
The funny thing is that duck is changing by the day. The head of the duck is mostly lighting, and guess what you're putting in your lighting today that isn't? And so that's going to actually attenuate the size of that head and the neck. And that's the other side of it. So what Jamie's saying is we might not need those 17 gigawatts. We might be able to, through energy efficiency and demand response, like Shmuel is saying very correctly, it might be a 2 gigawatt, and that's a smaller problem to solve, and it's a cheaper way to solve it through efficiency and demand response. I'm totally with you. We need to keep an eye on it because even if you're short by 10 megawatts, you can have a blackout. So you have to provide at any given moment exactly what people are using. And a 10 megawatt can start tripping the entire system. And that's the important part.
Last comments.
Well, I'll just offer a couple of things very quickly. Well, I said definitively we don't need to build new natural gas power plants. The PUC has approved building new natural gas power plants, but they're also challenging our utilities to deliver more distributed energy resources at the same time. SoCal Edison asked for permission to build 2,000 megawatts of natural gas. The commission said you could build 1,000, but you need to get the other 1,000 through distributed energy resources. In going further south, with the closure of the San Onofre nuclear generating facility, there is a resource gap. My personal view is it'd be a real shame if, because our nukes proved to be unreliable. We have to build more thermal, which is no more reliable, frankly, than renewables. Songs is a great example. That power plant shut down. So we can predict when our sun's going to shine and when it's not going to shine. So it's true that we are having to build some thermal. But another reason this is fiction is that the PUC is anticipating closure of a lot of power plants because of once-through cooling. If you look at the resource adequacy analyses, they say, oh, and by the way, the reason why we have 40% extra capacity in the system today is because the expected closures of the prior years never happened. So we're going to build a whole bunch of new power plants expecting once-through cooling closures that might not happen.
Go ahead.
My last comment is 2 words: democratize the smart meter.
Okay, so now let's thank our panelists. Thank you.